welcome to the Boomslang Airsoft Bounding Mine Assembly Guide. Aside from needing all of the printed parts, and they can be printed via the settings on the Colts page, you will also need a few bits and bobs. You need a couple of M4 bolts, one of them 15mm long and the other one 30mm. You will also need 3 4x17mm screws like this, 2 2mm by 10mm screws, a 5x50mm roofing bolt. These are the ones with the nice flat head, and these are exactly the same bolts that you use in the meteorite grenades. You'll also need a cotter pin that's roughly 2mm in diameter and about 50mm in length, as well as a keyring to attach to the end of it. You also need a 3mm by, let's call it 15mm spring, and you also need one M110 airsoft spring. You could probably get away with a slightly lower rating and a slightly higher rating, but I wouldn't deviate too far, otherwise you could end up with a spring that's not strong enough to fire the mine, or a spring that's too strong that makes it very hard to cock. Now, even though the two cut sections here are from a different spring, you can get away with just the one. You want to cut one end of it down to about 35 to 37mm, and then you can stick it on the end of the striker as if you were assembling a meteorite grenade. And I will include in the description the proper guide to how to assemble a meteorite fuse, so that way if you want to bend the spring with a blowtorch you can do that. If you go watch that guide, it'll be a lot better than me trying to explain it to you right now. And then taking your off-cutter spring, you want to go from the other uncut end, and you want to measure out approximately, let's call it about 75mm of spring. And this is the spring which actually launches the main charge out of the Boomslang. You want to make sure the spring is strong enough to launch it up in the air with enough force that when the detonation tether goes taut, it will actually fire the charge. And you will also need a weak spring, which is relatively small, with an outer diameter of about 13mm. This is what fires the release mechanism in the chassis. It doesn't have to be massively strong. And you'll also need some fishing line. And what more fitting fishing line can you find than this mine warfare fishing line? To be fair, you don't have to use fishing line, you can just use regular twine or string, and the way you tie it is you pass the line through whatever it is you want to tie, and then you tie a traditional knot, and then you tie another knot next to it. You basically loop it through and keep tying knots, so you end up with a big cluster of knots that really cinches down on the line. First of all, we are going to assemble the fuse of the main charge. So you want to take your fuse sear and you want to stick it on the underside of the bolt here by screwing it through. Using an M5 tap to cut a thread into the sear makes it a lot easier to do so, and you want to put some thread locker on the thread so that way this is nice and tight. And then you want to drop it through into the fuse. Now you want to take your spoon, and the new design has a built-in eye for you to tie the filament to, and you want to line it up with these two holes here, and then you want to take the two small screws, the two 2mm by 10mm screws, and you want to screw them into the side of the fuse body, and this will form the axle on which the spoon will rotate on. So with that screwed in, we can then check that it actually moves, and as you can see, the spoon moves inside the fuse. And we're going to take our striker and spring mechanism, and if you want to bend it to lock into the notch, which isn't on this one but it will be on the updated model, you can do so. But at the very least you want the cut end resting against the little step. You don't need to worry so much about the spring moving around on this one, but if you want to immobilize the spring with the little hook that you form on it with a blowtorch, then it will just help with a bit more stability and reliability of the fuse, and it might even make it easier to cock. So we can now screw the bolt into the striker, and again, if you attack that with an M5 thread, it should then screw in nice and easily. And you want to make sure the bolt is flush with the end so it doesn't stick out, so it won't mark the cap carriages. So we'll back it out slightly, and there we go. And it's probably worth now tying the other end of the tether line to the bottom of the chassis. So you want to thread it through the compartment on the front here, and you want to drop it through this hole here. And what I like to do is I like to tie a little nut on the end, so it then can be pulled into this hole here. And if you so wish, you can put some glue in there or epoxy that. And in this case, I've left it exposed just for now in case I need to access it, but that way the line is actually tethered to the chassis. Now we're going to take our small compression spring and fit it into the spoon like so. Take our spring guide and match the spring end up with that hole there, and this circular cutout allows the line to slide through it. And then you want to take 2 of the 4x17mm screws. Once you've made sure your spring's actually where it's supposed to be, you want to take 2 of the 4x17mm screws and put them diagonally opposite to each other to mount the spring guide to the top of the fuse. Make sure you don't trap the fishing line in any of the gaps or screws. And there we are. We now have an assembled fuse head. And what should happen when we push the mechanism in is it should cock like so, and then when the line's pulled, it should fire. If you don't use a strong enough spring to push the spoon down, what will end up happening is this can actually fire as it's launching, rather than when it gets to the end of the line. So if that does happen, put a stronger spring in it and it should take out the impact sensitivity of this head. Next up, we want to take our catch and our sear, and we want to line them up like so. And then we want to take our M4 by 15mm bolt. We want to screw it in through this mechanism to hold the sear into the catch. And with it screwed in place like that, the sear should pivot inside the catch. If you wish, you can put a bit of silicone oil on the inside there, and I also recommend you put some on the rounded edge here, as this pushes up against the chassis. And next we want to take our 13mm little soft spring, and we want to put it in this little hole here. It should align up that little hole there. And then we can take our remaining M4 bolt, which is the 30mm one, and we can use it to form a pivot, or even a fulcrum as some might say, for the catch on the side of the Boomslang. So when we pull this sear up, it should push the latch inwards towards the bore of the barrel. And it should slip nice and easily. Now we want to take our other cutting of the AEG spring and we want to slip it over the spring guide, and if you so wish you can use some epoxy or even a cable tie around the spring guide to hold this in place. And then we can take our ground spike and our remaining 4x17mm screw, and we can drop this screw through the central hole in the bottom of the mine. And we can use that to screw the ground spike onto the bottom of the chassis. You might want to put a bit of glue underneath that just to stop it coming undone. And there we go, we now have the ground spike. Next up you want to take some fishing line, and I would measure out about 12 to 15 feet. And you want to tie one end to the key through this loop here, and the other end through the little hole on the spool, and then you can wind it up around the spool like so. So now we've assembled the mine, let's prepare it for use. You want to take a cap carriage and stick an 8-shot cap ring on top of it, and you want to push it onto the pins. It might help to push it against a firm surface, and then you can drop it into the grenade body, and you want to make sure the top lettering is facing upwards. Now I'm just using dud caps for illustration, but next up you want to take the fuse mechanism and you want to cock it like so. And now we can screw the fuse head onto the grenade body. Now this is actually live, so be careful when you're loading it into the chassis. Now you want to make sure that the tether isn't caught in anything, including the spring. So we'll make sure it's gently pulled out like that. And we can then drop it into the chassis. The spring should slide into the large hole in the bottom. And then you can push it down like so. And if you pull up on the sear and hold that, we have now got it cocked. And if you keep holding it and you take your key, you can lower it down like so onto the key. I'm going to hold the key in place, and we're going to take our safety pin and thread it through the key, and then it should thread through the catch itself. Now the key might be slightly misaligned when you do this, but that allows the safety pin to bind up so it won't come out easily, and as you can see it's popped out the other side, and that safety pin is not coming out on its own. Next up we want to take the tether and we want to stuff it into this compartment on the end here. But do be careful that you don't pull on the tether too hard, because as we mentioned before, the fuse is now live. And of course, only arm this out on the field. There we go, we now have the line stuffed into the compartment. This allows the line to unwind nice and easily, otherwise it would get snagged on the spring if it was stuffed down the inside. Now we can take our spool and wind some line onto it until we can slide it up and onto the ground spike, like so. And if we turn it round, it will keep the line nice and taut and out of the way. And the Boomslang can now be stowed away in a pouch, and it's ready to be used. And to deploy the Boomslang, you want to detach this spool, wind some line out, stick this in the ground, hang it around a tree, whatever, hook it onto something. You then want to stick your Boomslang in the ground, and then you want to gently remove the safety pin. And it might be worth holding onto the key as you do it. I haven't got enough hands right now because this is not stuck in the ground. But the Boomslang is now armed. And if you pull on this line, it should fire the grenade out of the base, and I'm going to make sure I don't hit myself or the camera. And the springs come off because I haven't got it glued down, but as you can see, it has fired the charge. And that is how you assemble and use the Boomslang Airsoft bounding mine.